Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace in the water and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Satoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So today we begin the discussion on the fourth layer. We have been studying these different layers covering the Atman. Last week we concluded the discussion on the third layer called the Manomaya Kosha, the layer of the mind. Today we begin with the fourth layer. It's called Vijnanamaya Kosha. Literally translated, it means the layer of knowledge. But we will see what its actual meaning is as we look at this layer. So begin with verse 184. Buddhi buddhindriyai sardham savrittiv kartru lakshanaha vijnanamaya kosha syat pumsav samsara karanam. The layer of knowledge which endows agency is the mind with its modification and the senses of knowledge, and it is the cause of the person's samsara. Look at the phrase, the mind with its modification. So the Sanskrit word for modification is vritti. Oftentimes the mind is visualized, it's kind of a body of water, if you like. And every thought, every memory, every kind of a change that occurs in the mind is thought of as a wave or a ripple in that water. That's why those of you who have taken a look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras know that Patanjali defines yoga as the stilling of the mind. In other words, all these thoughts, memories, emotions, fears, every one of these things is producing these ripples and waves in the mind. And we know that when the water is filled with waves and ripples, it's disturbed. But if you go on the shore of a calm lake, the water is still. The water is transparent. You can see the reflection of what is at the bottom very clearly. So our mind is like that turbulent lake filled with all these ideas, emotions, and so on. And yoga really means stilling of that disturbed mind. So each of these waves is a modification. That's the Sanskrit way, the English way they sometimes translate. The word in Sanskrit, as I said, is vritti. So a mind with its modification, which could, as I have mentioned earlier, there are two obvious parts of our personality. One is the visible part, there's this physical body. There is the invisible part within, which oftentimes we just refer to it as the mind. A more technical term for that would be the inner instrument. If the body is the outer instrument, then there is this inner instrument, and the Sanskrit word for inner instrument is antah-karana. Antah means inner, karana means an instrument. So that is a better word for what we normally refer to as the mind. Now this inner instrument, a certain wave or a certain function of this inner instrument is what is called mind. And then certain other modification or a function of that same inner instrument is called the intellect. So do not think of the mind and intellect as two separate things inside. They are not two separate things. There is this visible body and there is this invisible instrument. Depending on the function, depending on the way it acts, this inner instrument can sometimes act as a mind. It's the same inner instrument can also act as the intellect. And that will be described later on. So if you look at the constitution or the constituents of this layer, they are exactly same as the layer of the mind. The layer of the mind also is mind plus the senses of knowledge. And this layer is also the mind plus the senses of knowledge. So the only distinction between these two layers is what modification of the mind is included there. So in the layer of the mind, it's the mind. And in the layer of the intellect, what we say Vijnanamaya Kosha, which we are studying now, it is the intellect or a buddhi. Now, one way to understand the different functions of the inner instrument is that when this inner instrument is in the mode of weighing the pros and cons, or in the mode of doubting something, or in a mode of not being able to decide this or that, just looking at the different options, wondering what to do, doubtful about this or that, those kind of waves, they are called the mind. So that is the function of the mind. So sometimes they say, samshayatmakam manaha. Mind is the one that raises doubts. It raises questions. It is able to see the pros and cons, but not able to decide what to do. Now there is this other function of the inner instrument which determines, it's called the determinative faculty. In Sanskrit they say nishchayatmakam manaha. So that part of the inner instrument, that function, not the part, that function of the inner instrument which determines or takes decisions, which knows what is right and wrong and which chooses, that is called the buddhi. So this layer that we are studying now is that function of the mind, that determinative function, and the senses of knowledge. Now, these two functions, the mind and the intellect, can also be thought of as the mind. When it is in the mind mode, it is the instrument, karana. When it is in the buddhi mode, the same inner instrument, it is called the agent or the karta. Because any kind of knowledge in the world is preceded by the knowledge of I. Without the sense of I, there is no knowledge. For instance now, if I say this is a folder in my hand. So so this knowledge of the folder comes by the idea that I am seeing this folder, I know this is a folder, I can identify it as a folder. So all knowledge, this I is at the foundation of all knowledge. And therefore, this layer, although it's called the layer of knowledge, is primarily the layer of knowledge of one's agency. We could also therefore think of it in terms of the ego, because ego is what is that I sense. And that I sense has at least two aspects to it. One is I as a doer. In Sanskrit, the word for doer is karta. And the second aspect of I is the I as the experiencer. In Sanskrit, it's called bhokta. And that's what our I does all through life. There are things we do with the awareness, I am doing this, I am thinking this. And this I, on one side it does things, and on the other side, the I experiences. So when I do something well, when I become successful, this I becomes happy. When I do something stupid, if I fail, then this I becomes sad. So the experience of joy and sorrow, that also goes to the I. The activity, for good and bad, is also initiated by the I. And so we can think of this fourth layer, Vijnanamaya Kosha, as either the knowledge of the I as an agent, or you could even think of it in terms of the ego as the doer. So, as I said in the beginning, although we literally translate it as the layer of knowledge, the real meaning is the layer of the ego as the doer. And it's generally, this is, I mean, we could also ask, why does the layer of knowledge come after the layer of the mind? Because the way these layers are ordered, the outermost layer comes first. That's why we began with the layer of the body. Then with the layer of the life force, which is inside. Inside that was the layer of the mind. Now, inside that is the layer of this ego. And the idea is that the instrument is somehow outer compared to the agent who is inside. And that's why this layer comes after the layer of the mind. Now, agency involves three things. And that in Sanskrit they call it jnana, ichcha, and karma. Jnana means knowledge, ichcha is the will, and karma is of course action. So the knowledge or the sense of I know, I understand, will, everything that we do, there has to be the push inside is given by the will. It's like this. If you have a desire spring in the heart, I want to go and I want to have a cup of tea. Now that desire by itself cannot do anything. It can just come up and say, I would like to have tea. Now, if I want to have tea, I need to will myself to get up, go to the kitchen, fix myself a cup of tea. So that's how it happens. Desire, then there is the will to translate that desire into action. So will can sometimes, in psychological terms, can be also referred to as intention. So desires come, but if a desire is not transformed or translated into an intention, it will not become an action. And we know oftentimes, it's not like we act upon every desire of the heart. Desires are continually coming up as a result of the samskaras in our mind. But then there are certain desires our will goes and grabs them and then says, yes, I intend to carry this out. And then it is followed by action. So agency involves all these three things: knowledge, will, and activity. And finally, this verse says, it is the cause of the person's samsara. So the agency endowed by this layer, that is what causes the perpetuation of the cycle of samsara. Because again, samsara means going, moving. In order to be a part of the samsara, I need the sense of I. I'm the one who is born. I'm the one who does things. I will die. I will be reborn. I will go here. I will go there. So this I is at the center of our life. And that is why it says it is the cause of the person's samsara. Verse 185. Anuvrajat chit pratibimba shaktihi vijnana saudhya prakritir vikaraha jnana kriyavan ahamitya jasram dehendriyadishu abhimanyate bhrusham. This layer of knowledge is a material product empowered by the reflection of consciousness which accompanies it. It always identifies itself intensely with the body, the senses, etc., and is endowed with the functions of knowledge and action. Look at the phrase, reflection of consciousness. One of the reasons the body appears conscious is that there is this source of consciousness within. Consciousness doesn't belong to the body. Consciousness is something that percolates through the body. It's like this, the light. This light that we get, this illumination that we get, doesn't belong to the bulb. When you go and buy a bulb in the market, there is no light there. But if we fix the bulb in the right way and then the power supplied to it makes that illumination possible. And it looks as if it's the bulb that is lighted, but really that light comes from the power behind it. Exactly in the same way, this bulb of the body, if you like, this consciousness doesn't belong to the body. It comes from inside. Now, each of these layers that we have, we could think in terms of their reflective power. Each of these layers does not have equal reflective power. So those parts which are very rough and gross, they don't reflect that much power. So there isn't that much reflection of consciousness through the body as much as from some of the finer parts within the body. And that's why the mind is more luminous than the body. The intellect, what we are looking at now, is even more luminous. And the reason why the mind and the intellect feel more luminous than the body, because if you remember, we saw in an earlier class, what are the constituents of the subtle body? What are the constituents of the mind? And we saw that the sattva particles, the sattva parts of all these 5 primal elements form the mind. The tamasic parts form the body. And tamas is darkness. Tamas is inert. It doesn't have as much reflective power. But sattva, because it is clear, it is transparent, therefore the intellect is able to reflect more of that consciousness than these other layers. And that is why it is said, empowered by the reflection of consciousness which accompanies it. It's a material product. The intellect is not the self. The self is the only non-material entity. The self is the only spirit within us. Everything else is material, including the ego. There is nothing spiritual about the ego. The sense of I is also material. And that's why they make it clear right away. The layer of knowledge, the very fact we are calling it a layer, itself makes it obvious that it's material. It always identifies itself intensely with the body, the senses. Now, only when it identifies with it will there be this knowledge, I am this, or this is my body, this is my mind. So without that identification, we wouldn't be able to call them as me or mine. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the sense of agency, it is endowed with the functions of knowledge and action. And action, the will part is already understood, because without the will, there cannot be any action. Verse 186, 187. Anadikalo ayamaham svabhavo jivas samasta vyavahara vodha karoti karmanyanupurva vasanaha punyani apunyani chatat phalani bhungte vichistrasvapi yonishu vrajan ayati niryati adha urdhvameshah asyaiva vijnanamayasya jagrat swapnadyavastha sukha-dukkha bhogaha. Known as the jiva. Many of you would have heard the term jiva that occurs often in Vedanta discourse. So this sense of I, this layer of knowledge, is the jiva. It is without beginning and identifies itself as I. Now, this without beginning is in the way it feels, not in the way it is. The reason is that philosophically, if something is without beginning, it will also be without end. And in that sense, it's not really without beginning. The only entity without beginning is the Atman. And that's why the Atman is immortal. But this layer will eventually die, it will go. And therefore, when it is said here as without beginning, it means it's been there, we never know, we don't know how it began. And everything that is connected with ignorance is like that. For instance, now if you do not know, let's say, some language. Let's say if you do not know Hebrew. So you could say, I'm ignorant of Hebrew. Now if someone were to ask you, when did your ignorance of Hebrew begin? You don't know. You will say, well, it's always been there. But it can end. Tomorrow if I go and take some classes, and then I will learn Hebrew and my ignorance will end. So it can end. And because it can end, we know that it must have had a beginning. Because only that which begins ends. That which has birth has death. Birth and death go together. Beginning and ending go together. And that's why it is without beginning only in a relative sense. Identifies itself as I. It carries out all activities, we saw how. Filled with desires from the past, it does things that are enjoined as well as those that are prohibited. All of our actions are influenced by samskaras. That's why it says desires from the past, the mental impressions which generate desire. And because of this, we do things that are good, that are bad, right or wrong. That's why it says enjoined or not enjoyed. And reap their results, karma and karma phala. For that it passes through diverse births, birth and rebirth in different bodies, growing up and coming down. Now again, all of these are very relative ways of describing. There is no up and down in space. But the natural human tendency is to, even when we begin thinking about God, we just naturally look up, as if God is up there and God is not here at the side. But that's how we think about it. And therefore, sometimes the books speak about higher births and lower births. Again, high, low, up, down are very relative terms. But when it says here going up and going down, we could think in terms of getting births which are more congenial to oneself, or in terms of either happiness or freedom, and going down would be being born with greater bondage, greater suffering. That's one way to understand them. It is this layer of knowledge that experiences waking, dream, and other states as also joy and sorrow. Because again, the sense of I is central to all of our experiences. Verse 188. Dehadi nishtha shrama dharma karma gunabhimanas satatam mameti vijnana kosho ayamati prakashah prakrishta sannidhya vashat paratmanah ato bhavatyesha upadhirasya yadatmadhi samsarati bhramena. It always identifies with the duties, activities, and characteristics related to the life's stages which belong to the body. Now, life stages are often thought of in traditional terms as four stages. The Sanskrit word for that is ashrama. So the first is the student stage, called the brahmacharya ashrama. Second is the married stage, called the grihastha. Third is the retired stage. In ancient times, they used to call it vanaprastha ashrama. When after retirement, nowadays people go to retirement homes. And olden times, they retired to a forest to stay in the hermitage of some sages, kind of old, ancient retirement homes, if you like. And then last stage was called Sannyasa ashrama, that is a state of hermit, when one renounces everything and devotes oneself entirely to the pursuit of the higher ideal. So this I always, and each of these stages has its own duties. We know that as student stage, before we get married, we have certain duties, certain activities, certain characteristics associated with that stage of life. Now, some of these duties end, but some of these duties continue, and some more duties are added when we start a family. In that way, every stage of life, we might leave behind certain duties, get new duties, and so on. And that is what this stage does. The layer of knowledge is highly effulgent because of its close proximity to the Supreme Self. Understandable. If we look at these layers from out to in, and we are going toward the Self, which is the innermost center, the essence of my being, then the fourth layer is closer to that spirit, and therefore it's more effulgent. But through delusion, views the layer as I and suffers transmigration. So the sense of I is what this layer endows. Verse 189. Yoyam vijnanamaya praneshu hridi surat swayam jyotihi kutastasannatma karta bhokta bhavatyupadhistaha. The self-effulgent Atman, whose essence is consciousness, shines in the heart and through the senses. Though immutable, it becomes the doer and the experiencer owing to its superimposed identity. So it's this Atman, self-effulgent, because it is the source of all consciousness. It is this that shines in the heart and through all of our senses. And that's what a meditator does. When we are asked to look in the heart, and we have seen this several times before, that it's not the anatomical heart, it's not even the heart at the seat of emotions, it's the spiritual heart, and that is what is referred to here. So, in deep and intense meditation, a real state of meditation, most of the time when what we call meditation is really our effort to direct our mind toward the spiritual ideal. As long as there is effort involved, it's not really meditation yet. I mean, if you want to look at meditation as meditation is a spontaneous flow of the mind toward that object of our meditation, toward the goal, toward the divine. Now, if the mind doesn't go there spontaneously, of course, we have to then coax the mind, train the mind, discipline the mind to do that. And that's what japa usually is. That when we repeat the mantra or we say a prayer, we are using the faculties of the mind, we are using the power of sound, we are using the power of visualization, of form, of color. All of these things we are using to keep the mind tethered to our object of meditation. Because the mind has become not yet disciplined yet, it's become very restless, it's suffering from attention deficit syndrome, it kind of goes here and there. So we are saying, no, just hold on to this, only this one sound, only this one form. Don't go here and there. And with practice, gradually, what needs extreme effort in the beginning, over time becomes effortless. Whenever people have tried to play a musical instrument, they know this well. On the very first day of your first class, while learning to play the guitar or the piano or any musical instrument, or learning anything new for that matter, we know the first, unless you're some child prodigy who brought some memories from your past birth, usually the first day you're just trying to figure out what's what, and nothing is going to turn out all right. But if you practice well, you learn with concentration, day after day after day after day, then what needed immense effort in the beginning becomes effortless afterwards. When you hear Yo-Yo Ma play, when you hear some of these stalwarts play this instrument, it just appears like, wow, it's so simple, it's so easy, it appears so effortless, and it brings so much joy. But it's good to remember that whenever these great musicians play with such apparent ease, behind that ease have been days, months, and years of effort involved, years of practice involved. Only then it becomes effortless. Meditation is exactly like that. If you are lucky, well, on the very first day you might enter into samadhi, and through God's grace, anything is possible. But again, we don't have much control over that. What we do have control over is to put our best effort day after day, without losing hope, without becoming hopeless, just holding on to hope with faith to keep on practicing, no matter how much effort is needed. And then gradually, that kind of a patience, that kind of perseverance eventually pays off. And then it becomes effortless. And then you are able to see that shining, the Atman shining in the heart, that effulgence of the Atman, you are able to experience it directly. Though immutable, it becomes the doer and the experiencer. So immutable means Atman doesn't have any parts. But again, because of superimposition, the Atman can appear to be or do things that it's impossible for it to do. Just like a rope will always be a rope. it cannot become a snake. But again, through superimposition, if you look at the rope in a semi-lit room, it could be mistaken for a snake. So although nothing has changed, it can appear to be so. So similarly, the Atman, the true self, the spiritual self, is birthless and deathless. It cannot change. But because of superimposition, just like the rope can become the snake, this immutable Atman can become the doer and the experiencer. Verse 190. Swayam parichedamupetya buddhehe tadatmya doshena param vrishatmanah sarvatmakasannapi vikshate swayam swata pruthaktvena mrudo ghataniva. Though being the self of all, the Atman acquires limitations by identifying itself with the false I of the layer of knowledge and sees itself as different, as the clay might do when seeing jars made from itself. It's pretty clear. Think about the example given in the end is if you have different objects made from clay. Let's say there is a clay jar and a clay plate. So the clay jar might acquire the identity, I am a jar. And the clay plate may acquire the ego, the identity, I am a plate. And they might fight against each other. I am superior to you, I am better than you. The jars are the best in the world, and the plate will say, no, the plates have come before this. I mean, the kind of arguments that occur in our daily life. But essentially, they both are clay. They are not different. They are just one. But because of this identification with the form, all these different tensions are set up. Exactly in the same way, the clay here is this consciousness, Chit, Chaitanya. So we are all one, and literally one, not just figuratively. It's not a poetic metaphor that we are one. Literally we are one. Unfortunately, we have gotten identified with these different forms, and therefore it feels I'm different from you, you are different from others. Human beings are different from animals, animals are different from plants, and we just keep on seeing differences everywhere. And that's why, if we look deeply, we will see that beyond the form, beyond all these apparent differences, the same self dwells in all. 191. Upadi sambandha vashat paratma yupadi dharman anubhati tad gunaha ayo vikara navikari vanhivat sadaika rupopi parasvabhavat. Though being eternally transcendent and unchanging, the Supreme Self takes the form of the superimposed identity due to superimposition. Like fire, though formless, takes the form of the iron which it turns red hot. So this example often comes in Vedanta texts. If you have let's say, a spherical iron ball, and you put it in fire and heat it until it becomes red hot. So because the ball is spherical, the fire will appear spherical. Now fire doesn't have any particular shape, but it takes the shape of whichever object it gets identified with. And that's the example given here to show that the Atman is eternally transcendent and unchanging, but because it identifies itself with this material, changing, mortal body, it begins to think of itself as also changing and mortal. So our present experience that we are human beings, we are mortal, and so on, is a superimposed identity. Our real identity is that we are the transcendent being. So sometimes it is said, we are not human beings who are trying to become divine. We are divine beings who are mistakenly seeing ourselves as human. So that's the way Vedanta looks at it. So we will stop here today. If you have any ideas, thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
Pranam Maharaj. So, intellectually, if we understand, like we can understand that we are not the body, and we can quite understand that we are not the mind, but how can we understand we are not the ego?
Good question. Yes. And because the ego is inside and more subtle, it requires more effort. And therefore, we can begin by denying or beginning by eliminating our identity with the body and mind and so on. But when we come to the ego, the practice of the different yogas, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, certainly helps. What Sri Ramakrishna pointed out was a perhaps relatively easier and practical method. And he said that no matter how much we try to get rid of the ego, we might seem as if we have succeeded for a few minutes, and then out of nowhere it suddenly crops up again. And so he said, if this ego doesn't want to go away, then he used the word which gets translated into English as, let this rascal ego then remain as the servant of God. And so one of the things that we can do is connect this ego with the divine being. So right now, the ego, what Ramakrishna called is the unripe ego, so to speak. The I sense attached to any of the material characteristics or material entities in the world is unripe. That's not very helpful to advance spiritually. But what he said was the ripe I would be an I that is connected with God. There is still ego involved, but is connected with God. For instance, instead of having the ego, oh, I am this or I am that, I am the smartest kid in town, or I am this. And people have different ways of, different kinds of things that they are proud of. But for a spiritual seeker, that ego can come in forms of, I am a child of God, I am a devotee of God, I am a servant of God, or I am a spiritual seeker. So there is this I, there is certainly ego there, but if that ego is connected with the divine, then that ego, it's easier to let go when the time comes. But an ego that is connected with the things of the world binds us more and more. Your observation is right. Ego is certainly the toughest nut to crack in some ways. There is one a proverb, you can say, or a usage which in Bengali, which Sri Ramakrishna used to quote. And what it means in English is, when will I be free? When I will cease to be. When the ego goes, then that's freedom. So that's like the last barrier. So before we reach that barrier, let us try to remove the relatively easier barriers first, and then we can attack the ego.
Swamiji, in verse 185, it says, this layer of knowledge is a material product empowered by the reflection of consciousness which accompanies it. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little confused by the reflection of consciousness. Two questions. One, what is this concept of reflection? It's not the same reflection, I believe, when the light reflects off an object and then we are able to see it. or is it? That's one question, Swamiji. And
yeah, I mean, if you want to be like, probably I would say a more accurate term probably would be refraction in some ways. I mean, think about a crystal and kept near a red hibiscus flower. Now, if you look from the other side, the crystal will also appear red. So that's essentially how it happens. Just the proximity of the Atman near the layer seems to acquire certain characteristics of it. So the word reflection is used in rather loosely, but that's the meaning. Yeah.
okay, sorry. One follow-up question
Yeah.
Is this refraction of consciousness not applicable to other layers that we studied?
It
Why
happens.
is it?
It happens.
Okay.
But it's like this. If there is a crystal, then the refraction is more. You can see it from the other side. But if there is another piece of glass which is like not clear, not transparent, you might still see something, but not as clearly. And if there is something else which is even which won't allow any light to pass through, then you will see very little of it. That's how it is. And so sometimes people say that we make the distinction between, oh, I'm a living being, I am conscious, but this table is not conscious. And it's also possible to see that perhaps this layer over what we call as inanimate object is so, what is the word for, which won't reflect any light? Opposite of transparent, complete.
Opaque?
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. So maybe you could say the layer over what we think as lifeless objects is so opaque that the consciousness is not able to come. In fact, this great scientist, the turn of the 19th century, Jagdish Chandra Bose in Calcutta, he did research, and through certain scientific instruments, measurements, he found that even metals and even plants react. So it's possible to see that there is some reactions from even things that are not generally seen as living creatures. Yeah. So it's not a very clear line between living and non-living as we sometimes think. It's it's a spectrum. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, so we will stop here today. When we meet next week, we'll begin with verse 192. It really begins with a question that the student asks, and that will be our starting point when we meet next week. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagatgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhu. On Sunday, our subject will be being a lotus. On Saturday, we'll have meditation as usual, and next Wednesday, we will meet again here. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.